Welcome to part 4 of Knut's top Sibelius tips. This week we're going to be looking at samples and how to best use them when you're arranging. If you've not seen last week's episode, that one was all about ways to sort of speed up your arranging process or otherwise improve arrangements. You can check that out, I've got it linked on the screen, and if not, and you're ready for this one, then just sit back and enjoy. Tip number 1 for using samples. Use bad samples when arranging. I know it's quite annoying if you use stuff like general MIDI because it sounds really artificial and it doesn't always do your score any justice. But I've actually found that the problem with working with so-called good samples is that you start writing for the samples rather than using them for arranging for real instruments. So if you have samples that, for instance, sound really beautiful at a really quiet dynamics, but then they start sounding, a little bit piercing when they get loud, then you might think, oh, but that's not going to sound nice. I should keep them quiet. But that's not necessarily a representation of what the real instruments need. I think what is valuable in samples is that they spark your imagination without giving you too much of a representation of what might happen, because you do need to use your imagination even when using samples. So general MIDI, while it sounds terrible, is actually really good for arranging. Sibelius comes pre-packaged with some samples, some of which are actually alright to arrange with, but others which are problematic. A really common problem with good sound libraries is that they maybe have a slow attack, which makes it really hard to, it colors the sound too much. You need something that's really neutral. If you don't know how to change your sound libraries, I'll just show you quickly in the software here. So this is the score, and let us have a look at the sample libraries. So I've now set it to general MIDI, and I'll just play a small excerpt of this arrangement with general MIDI, so you can hear what that sounds like. So I mean that sounds really fake, doesn't it? But on the other hand, it's not gonna sound real anyway. These are voices who are singing words, or syllables in this case, and they're gonna end up singing words. So you're not gonna get something that sounds real. That is fine. What you're looking for is something that gives you sort of a nice impression of what it might sound like. I think what's good about general MIDI is it doesn't have slow attack, so all the notes start exactly on the beat, no problem. One problem I do have with it is that it doesn't play back swells correctly. So like this does not get played back correctly. This forte piano with an accent, nothing is being played there. That is the only gripe I have with it. Now you could also use, I've got a few here. Let's look at Sibelius 7 sounds. It has to load and everything. And let's just listen to it with that one instead. Okay, so I mean, that also sounds quite artificial, doesn't it? The piano sound is quite nice, but the voices do sound, not very good, simply put. Sort of the issue I have with this library also is the fact that it's got slow attack, which makes it really tricky when you're doing rhythmic stuff. Like this pattern just sounds like a mess. And that is a problem. And then you might fall into the trap of being like, oh no, but it sounds bad on the samples. To then not think about, well, yes, but this is a pretty nice singable mid-range line for the baritone singers, so that will sound fine with real voices. So yeah, be very careful of writing for samples. I'll show you one more which I've used for a long time, Garriton's Personal Orchestra, which is, yeah, it's kind of an okay quality, sort of cheapish, but like pretty okay sound library. It's probably my favorite for arranging because the samples are extremely neutral. So if you listen to it now, you'll see what I mean. So yeah, I mean, it of course doesn't sound like real voices, and I'd say that the piano sample is probably better in the Sibelius 7 sounds, but these choral sounds are very neutral. They play back most of these swells, and they play them exactly in time, which is pretty much what you need. So yeah, I generally use those when I do my arranging. But I mean, I honestly think that you can get away with just using general MIDI, and I wouldn't invest time in getting expensive samples unless you're working in DAWs, and you're, creating sampled music. Then yeah, absolutely, you should probably see if you can find some good ones to use. But for arranging, it's just not worth it, in my opinion. But yeah, there you go. So those are a few examples of different sample libraries that I've been using. Tip number 2, make all the dynamics apply to all voices. By default, when you put in expression text or like hairpins, it will, for hairpins, it will set it to all, whereas for dynamics, expression marks that is, like pianoforte, it tends to set it to just voice 1. And that might be fine if your score never divides. But if you're using several voices on the same staff, what might happen is that the dynamic is only applied to one of the voices, not both. Quick fix for avoiding this is to just set all the dynamics and hairpins to all voices. If you've got a situation where you want one of the voices on the staff to have a different dynamic, then yeah, you wouldn't do this. But in most cases, this is what you want. So let me show you exactly what I mean. All right, I've got the score here, and if I want to make sure that all the dynamics apply to all the voices, you just select all and you filter dynamics, Shift Alt D, and that will select all expression text and hairpins in the whole score. Now you see a lot of this is marked. If we zoom in, over here for instance, so the hairpin is usually marked all voices, but the expression text is usually just marked voice 1. So if you want to make absolutely sure that the expression text will apply to all voices, just press all, and you see it all becomes light blue, which means it applies to all voices. Now if I only wanted, for whatever reason, if I only wanted the expression text to affect voice 2, then I just press voice 2, and now you see it's a nice little shade of green. And now it will only apply to voice 2. But we want voice all, so we select voice all. And that's all there is to it. Tip number 3 about using samples. And this is kind of something I discovered quite recently. Use the Rehearsal Recordings plugin. And this is something that, well, it mostly will apply to choral music because not all ensembles really need rehearsal recordings, but choirs do benefit from having rehearsal recordings, even if they're good readers, just because it helps them to have something to practice along with. And in one of my earlier videos, I suggested this like really long, tedious way of doing it. I've actually found that someone thought this was long and tedious, and they made a plugin which comes pre-installed in Sibelius. It's called Rehearsal Recordings, and I'll show you how to use it. To find the Rehearsal Recordings plugin, you just go to the Home tab, Plugins, and it's right there at the top, Rehearsal Recordings. So when you press this, by default, it will give you all parts. Now, I don't need a rehearsal recording for the piano because I'm going to expect that the piano can read music or will, listen to the original and maybe use the chord symbols to improvise something. So yeah, you can clear that one. You need one for soprano, alto, and baritone. So next thing you want to do, export both soloist and accompaniment. And yeah, you definitely don't want to use the other one for choirs because they need to hear each other to be able to pitch their notes. I would go into soloist options and set the accompaniment volume. It's to 30% here. I'd say 50% is probably a bit nicer. Actually, you could go with half mute. Let's just go with half mute. And yeah, you want them on different sides. So I will generally put the soloist on the left and the accompaniment on the right. It doesn't really matter, but yeah, the padding does help just to isolate the different voices. That's okay. Now you'll see this will be exported as WAV files. So you will want to convert them into MP3 files or something similar afterwards, because WAV files take up a lot of space. And I mean, you're exporting synthesized music here. Just make MP3 files. And you just press OK. And it just asks you where you want to stick it. Fine. Desktop. OK. And then it does it. And you just sit back and let it do all the work that I used to do manually before. So I'm glad I figured out that I could do this. So those are some tips for better using samples when you're arranging. Remember to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and share this video with your friends if you think they'll find it useful. Next week, we'll be looking at layout and how to improve the way you do layout in Sibelius. I shall see you for that episode.